I am so sorry, so let's start this all over again. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Wilbur Francis, and I'm the Project Director for Post-Secondary Education at the UCLA Targent Center. The Targent Center is a federally designated Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, and your host for today's webinar. Support for today's webinar comes from the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office through a contract that enables us to provide professional development and technical assistance to community colleges, the SPS, working to provide equitable services, supports and opportunities for students with disabilities, including intellectual disabilities and autism. Before we get started, I would like to address a couple of logistical items. The webinar is being recorded. It is being recorded and archived to allow participants to listen to this information again and to allow others who are not able to attend at this time to access this information. A link will be provided to the recording after the webinar. All phone lines are muted. I would like to direct your attention to the Adobe Connect chat box, which may be found near the bottom right of your computer monitor. At this time, I would like each person to type his or her name into the chat box. Throughout the call, we will be monitoring the chat box, and you may use it for submitting questions to the presenters. I'm noticing that I'm hearing some lines sound like they are open, so I'm going to ask everyone if you would hit *6. After each presenter, we will take approximately 5 to 7 minutes to address any questions you have submitted for the presenters to address. At the very end of the call, if time allows, we will open the webinar for additional questions. At that time, you may use the raise hand feature at the top center of the menu panel to raise your hand, and we may unmute your line to allow for questions. And last but not least, please mute your computer speakers. Typically, you can find an icon for your computer speakers displayed at the bottom right of your computer monitor. We are pleased to bring you today's webinar, Federal Financial Aid for Students with Intellectual Disabilities under the Higher Education Act of 1965. Your presenters today will be Jessica Finkel, Ian Foss, Molly Boyle, Eric Latham, and Jeff Ross. Jessica Finkel is an analyst with the Office of Post-Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. Since joining the department in 2008, she has worked on a wide variety of issues and initiatives, including aid for students with intellectual disabilities, campus safety and emergency preparedness, gainful employment, and consumer tools and information. Before joining the department, Jessica earned her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology at the University of Virginia. Ian Foss is a program specialist at Federal Student Aid, an office of the U.S. Department of Education. Since joining the U.S. Department of Education in 2010, he has worked primarily on student loan issues such as 150% direct subsidized loan limits, income-driven repayment plans, loan counseling tools, and public service loan forgiveness. He also works on intellectual disability issues. Prior to joining the U.S. Department of Education, Ian was a policy fellow in the Governor of Maryland's Office of Policy, where he focused on P-12 education reform. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Texas in San Antonio and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Baltimore. Molly Boyle works as a trainer and technical assistance provider for Think College and is a TIPSIT cohort liaison. Molly provides professional development to college faculty, administrators, and disability support personnel on universal course design and effective teaching strategies for ensuring equal access to all students, including those with disabilities. Previously, she coordinated the Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Program for students with intellectual disabilities at Mass Bay Community College in Wesley, Massachusetts. Molly's expertise includes the provision of individual supports for post-secondary education for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, universal design for learning, online teaching, and adaptive technologies. Eric Latham joined UCLA Extension in 2006 as the founding director of Pathway, a post-secondary education program for students with intellectual disabilities. Pathway has been recognized as an exemplary program by the UCLA Chancellor, the Encore Foundation, the Down Syndrome Society of Los Angeles, and the University Continuing Education Association. Mr. Latham has more than 27 years experience working with and for people with disabilities as a direct support professional, program director, administrator, and advocate. Jeff Ross has served as Director of Student Support Services at Taft College since 1976. Jeff is a learning disability specialist and developmental disability specialist. Among Jeff's many professional accomplishments is the design and establishment of the Taft College Transition to Independent Living program for individuals with developmental disabilities. This highly successful on-campus residency program for individuals with developmental disabilities is the only one of its kind on a community college campus and has received both local and national recognition for its outstanding accomplishments. He is co-founder of the California Consortium on Higher Education for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Again, we apologize for the technical difficulties that we experienced previously with the telephone lines. We'd like to start our webinar at this point. Thank you, Jessica, Ian, Molly, Eric, and Jeff, for your willingness to share this information with the California community colleges. And now, without further ado, here's Jessica Finkel and Ian Foss.
Can everyone hear me? I think we're good. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. And I guess we'll just get started. As you all know, there's been a movement over the last several years towards creating opportunities for students with intellectual disabilities on college campuses, broadening access to and fostering quality programs that serve these students well. This is something that Ian and I have been involved with for a few years now, and we're committed to supporting schools that want to develop these opportunities by sharing information and answering questions about the financial aid piece of this puzzle. Today we'll be covering the statutory and regulatory framework behind the federal student aid programs and students with intellectual disabilities, the student eligibility requirements, and the program eligibility process. Let's see if this works. If everybody sees the little icon to raise your hands. How many of you have been to one of our presentations before? All right, see some hands raised. How many of you are new to this field, new to this financial aid for students with intellectual disabilities area? Okay, great. How many of you have already been through our program approval process? Okay, still a couple hands up. That's great. Those of you who have been through some of our presentations or webinars before, a lot of this will be review, but we do have some updated information to share, especially in response to some recent questions. And if you're new, I hope this is a good introduction for you, and please don't hesitate to let us know if you have questions at the end. Let's see. Will, do I advance the slides, or do you? Okay, thanks. So first of all, to give you some context for today's discussion, support for students with intellectual disabilities in post-secondary settings was first added to the Higher Education Act of 1965, which is a key piece of federal legislation related to post-secondary education in the United States. And the Higher Education Act, I'll call it the HEA, authorizes a wide variety of programs, including some that are related to preparing students for college and supporting them while they're in school, some related to teacher training programs, others related to international education, and many more. There are lots of programs under the HEA. Now, you might hear some people talking about the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008, or the HEOA, and that was the law that reauthorized and amended the HEA to add provisions to the law specifically related to supporting students with intellectual disabilities in a post-secondary setting. It's been several years now since the HEOA passed and was incorporated into the HEA, so we at the department normally just refer to these provisions as being part of the HEA. but in case you hear some people talking about the HEOA, that's why it's so. The HEOA amended the HEA. Now, the HEA has two main pieces related to students with intellectual disabilities, and they're in Title VII and Title IV of the law. Title VII authorizes the transition program for students with intellectual disabilities, also known as the TIPSID program, and that's a discretionary grant that's designed to support model demonstration programs that promote the successful transition of students with intellectual disabilities into higher education. According to my colleague, students with intellectual disabilities can access federal student aid funds under three Title IV programs: the Federal Pell Grant, the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, or FSBOG, and the Federal Work-Study Programs, which we refer to in shorthand as FWS. Now, as you might have noticed, all of these programs are grant programs. Or, well, Federal Work-Study isn't quite a grant program, but let's think about it in that framework for today. We're not talking about Title IV loans for these students. And as I mentioned, the Title IV programs are different from a discretionary grant program, such as the TIPSID under Title VII, or some of the other programs under the HEA. They're not based on a competitive application process that judges students or programs or an application based on merit. Instead, if a student meets the eligibility requirements, so in this case, they meet the definition of a student with an intellectual disability and they meet the other student eligibility requirements, then they're going to be eligible to receive Title IV funds to attend an approved program or an eligible program at an institution of higher education. Now, there are four related sections in the regulations that pertain to Title IV aid in students with disabilities, intellectual disabilities specifically, and they're all contained in Subpart O of Part 668 of Title 34 of the Code of Federal Regulations. These four sections, it's 230, 231, 232, and 233, cover the scope of the regulations. They have some definitions. It covers the student eligibility requirements and the program eligibility requirements. If you're looking for the actual regulatory text, I suggest going to the electronic CFR online. It's www.ecfr.gov. Stands for the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. So that's where you can go. If you don't happen to have your trusty CFR at your desk like I do, you can still find the Code of Federal Regulations online. So let's spend some time looking at the student and program eligibility components. Next slide, please. The basic premise of Title IV aid is that you have an eligible student attending an eligible program at an eligible institution. That's how someone would receive funds. So in this case, if a student meets the definition of a student with an intellectual disability and meets the general student eligibility requirements where they apply, and they're attending a CTP program that's been approved as such by the Department of Education, and that's the U.S. Department of Education, not the California State Department, and if the student has financial need, then the student can receive Title IV funds. Next slide, please. The student eligibility. The eligibility requirements for a student with an intellectual disability to receive Title IV aid are described in 668.233, one of those four sections under Subpart O that I just mentioned. And these requirements mirror those that apply to all students very closely. So, for example, a student must be a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen. They have to have an accurate or authentic Social Security number. They can't be duly enrolled in an elementary or secondary school and an institution of higher education and also get aid. So while they have to meet several of the general eligibility requirements, there are a couple differences that we built into the regulations that are designed to ensure that these students don't face any unnecessary or barriers to accessing Title IV aid. And there are three main differences. First of all, typically an eligible student has to be working towards a degree or certificate to qualify for Title IV aid. And in fact, students have to attest to that on the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. This particular requirement does not apply to students with intellectual disabilities because under the statute, a CTP program, that's short for Comprehensive Transition and Postsecondary Program, may be a degree program, it could be a certificate program, but it could also be a non-degree or non-certificate program. So this particular requirement doesn't apply. Second, usually a student has to have a high school diploma or its equivalent to be eligible for aid. Students with intellectual disabilities are not required to meet this particular criterion. One thing I wanted to quickly clarify here for anyone who might be concerned about the changes to the high school diploma ability to benefit law. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2012 removed ability to benefit tests and the option of completing 6 credits of post-secondary work as a pathway to Title IV aid. And we've heard from a number of you and your colleagues that this is really limited to eligibility of students with a high school diploma or its equivalent, the ability of students with disabilities to get aid. We are concerned about the negative effects of this change on students with disabilities who are earning modified diplomas in a number of states. However, the change in the law doesn't have any practical effect for the narrow population of students that we're talking about today, students with intellectual disabilities, because this exception is in the regulations. They don't have to have a high school diploma or its equivalent to be eligible. And then third, students have to maintain satisfactory academic progress in his or her course of study in accordance with the institution's published Satisfactory Academic Progress, or SAP, standard. The regulations specify that while students in CTP programs must be making satisfactory academic progress, which has to do with whether they're moving through the program at an appropriate pace to finish in a reasonable amount of time, whether they're performing adequately and doing good work, it's all built into this SAP policy. So while students have to be making SAP, they have to be doing so under a SAP policy that's unique to them. And this policy can be different from the policy from the rest of the students at an institution. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. But whatever your SAP policy is for students in your CTP programs, it has to be the same for all of the students in that program. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to meeting these general student eligibility requirements, with the few exceptions we went through, these students also have to meet the definition of a student with an intellectual disability in order to be eligible for aid. Section 760 of the Higher Education Act, and accordingly in the regulations, that section defines a student with an intellectual disability as a student with a cognitive impairment characterized by significant limitations in intellectual and cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills, and who is currently or was formerly eligible for a free appropriate public education or FAPE under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. To be eligible for student aid, a student would have to meet both parts of this definition, and it's up to an institution to make the determination that the student does meet the definition, and it's also up to the institution to document that this is the case. Now, as far as documentation, the institution has to have a record from the student's local educational agency, sometimes referred to as an LEA, that the student is or was eligible for special education-related services under FAPE, and it has to have documentation that the student has an intellectual disability. Now, in some cases, and this varies by state and by LEA, the record has to specify that the student has an intellectual disability. But if not, there are a few other options that an institution could use to document that the student meets this part of the definition. In lieu of an LEA record identifying specifically intellectual disability, an institution could use a documented, comprehensive, and individualized psychoeducational evaluation and a diagnosis of an intellectual disability by a psychologist or another qualified professional. A school could also use a record of the disability from a local or state educational agency or another government agency, such as the Social Security Administration or maybe the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency in your state. But the bottom line is that a school has to be able to document that a student has both an intellectual disability and that the student was eligible for FAPE under the IDEA in order to be eligible for student aid. Next slide, please. Now, the last piece here is that before an eligible student in an approved CTP program can receive aid, he or she also has to demonstrate that they have financial need. And in order to receive Title IV funds, all students, whether they have a disability or not, have to begin by filling out the FAFSA, which I mentioned earlier is the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And this form collects primarily student and parent financial information that is then used to determine how much a family is expected to be able to contribute towards a student's education. And we call that the EFC, Expected Family Contribution. Now, if a student's cost of attendance is greater than the student's EFC, then that student is considered to have financial need. And the amount and type of aid that a student may receive generally depends on their level of need. Pell Grants and Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grants, or FSEOG grant funds, in particular, are designed to support the neediest students. So those funds, for example, would go to the students with the highest levels of financial need first. Next slide, please. Now, as far as when to complete the FAFSA, when to fill it out, students and families can fill it out before a CTP program is approved. So if the program is approved during the payment period, which in many cases is the semester, the student will receive funds retroactively to the beginning of that period. So, for example, if a family fills out a FAFSA during the summer, they want to go to this program, and the program hasn't received approval from the department yet. But if the program is approved after the start of the fall semester and the student has already filled out their FAFSA, then they would be paid retroactively back from the beginning of that fall term. Now, we've had a few questions in particular about the FAFSA and how students with intellectual disabilities should respond to them. For example, question number 26 on the FAFSA asks, when you begin college, what will be your high school completion status? And it gives 4 response options. You can select high school diploma, GED or certificate, homeschooled, or none of the above. A student with an intellectual disability should pick the one that applies to their situation. If they earned a high school diploma, then they would check that option. If they check none of the above, that's fine too. The response to this question doesn't affect whether or not someone's FAFSA is going to be processed. So again, you pick the one that makes the most sense for your situation. Similarly, question 29 asks, when you begin the school year, what will be your grade level? And the answer to this will also depend on the status of a specific student, and the student would select the response that best reflects his or her own experience.
I'm on the webinar. Oh, sorry.
So, for example, a first-time CTP program student who has never before attended college would select the response, never attended college and first-year undergraduate. Question 30 asks, when you begin the school year, what degree or certificate will you be working on? And the answer is going to depend on the CTP program in which the applicant is enrolling. If that CTP program awards a credential to students who complete it, then the applicant should select the credential that the program awards. If the program does not award a credential, then the applicant would indicate other or undecided is the last option on the FAFSA. And then the last one I wanted to touch on is question number 94. It asks, how many people in your household will be college students in this award year? Any other family member who's completing a FAFSA should include the student who is or who will be enrolled in an approved CTP program and vice versa. And this information will be considered in the calculations of the student's expected family contribution, or that EFC, by dividing the family's EFC by the number of students enrolled in college to get an EFC for each student. And it increases the amount of aid for which the student may be eligible above what would have otherwise been the case if they were the only student who was listed on the FAFSA as being in college, or if their sibling filled it out and only their sibling were indicated as being in college. Next slide, please. Now, as with student eligibility and students with intellectual disability, we're going to move a little bit into the program eligibility portion. And so similarly, there are some general program eligibility requirements, and then there's some special things that apply to CTP programs. General program eligibility requirements include things like meeting the minimum length of time requirements, having the appropriate state authorization to offer the program, things like that. But then there are some specialized requirements that we look at when we're looking at an application for a CTP program. CTP programs have to be individually approved by the Department of Education. In other cases, a school would not necessarily have to apply specifically for a new program if it's sort of within the same scope of what they've offered before. So these are a little bit different because they have to be individually approved. They have to meet the definition of a CTP program, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. A school has to have, as we said, a satisfactory academic progress policy for the program, which again outlines how the institution will determine if students are moving forward in the program at an acceptable pace and with acceptable quality work. As I mentioned when we were talking about student eligibility, the STAT policy that you have for your CTP program may be the same as you have for other students and other programs at your institution, or it could be different, but it does have to be the same for all students in a particular CTP program. Normally, programs have to culminate in a degree or certificate, but CTP programs have a little bit of a different case. To be eligible, they could offer a credential, or in the alternative, they would need to have identified outcomes for enrolled students. In order to be eligible, in order to have their CTP program designated eligible for aid, an institution would also have to document to us that they've notified their accrediting agency that they're planning to offer or that they are offering a CTP program. I would note here that you do not have to have accrediting agency approval at this point. We don't have a specialized accrediting agency looking at these programs yet. So you don't need approval, but you do need to be able to document and show that you let your accrediting agency know about the program. And then lastly, you also need to have an established program length, and you have to have the number of equivalent credit or clock hours in the program. And Ian will talk about that in a little bit. Now, CTP programs are defined in Subpart O of the regulations, which I mentioned. And this definition very closely tracks the definition in the HEA. Sorry, next slide, please. Or no, I'm sorry, you got it right. Sorry, stay where you are. Thank you. A CTP program has to be offered by a Title IV participating institution. It has to be provided in person. It has to be designed specifically to support enrolled students in preparation for gainful employment. It needs to have an advising and curriculum structure. That curriculum structure, again, as with your STAT policy, could be the same structures that you use for other programs, for other students at your institution, or it could be one dedicated to your CTP program. And it also has to require interaction between students with intellectual disabilities and those without intellectual disabilities. At least half of the length of the program. And then half of the program is a little bit flexible. Maybe half of your program term by term has this interaction, or maybe, for example, you have a 4-year program. In the first 2 years, students are mostly interacting with other students with intellectual disabilities, and the second half of the program, in the second 2 years, fully integrated doing an internship of that sort. So this half of the length of the program is a flexible standard. So next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Ian at this point.
Thanks, Jessica. Jessica spent a fair amount of time talking about all of the various eligibility criteria that students and programs and institutions must meet before they can offer Title IV aid to students with intellectual disabilities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process of how you go about becoming an approved CTP program. Before I get into that, I'd like to stress that there are some resources available that can help you find step-by-step instructions of exactly what must be done. We have an Information for Financial Aid Professional, or IFAP, website where we posted an electronic announcement back in 2011 that contains those step-by-step instructions, and there's a link to it on this slide. If you take nothing else away from this session, it should be that you, as representatives of the programs or the academic side of the house, for lack of a better term, have to work very, very closely with representatives of the financial aid office. You understand how your programs are structured, and so you are in the best position to explain how your program meets the definition of a CTP program. But there are a number of basic financial aid eligibility criteria that these programs also need to meet, and it's the financial aid office that can provide you all of the support that you need in meeting those requirements or demonstrating that you meet those requirements when trying to get your program approved. Now, the program approval process is kicked off by an institution submitting our electronic application for approval to participate in the federal student financial aid programs. That's pretty long, which is why we call it EAP. It is contained on the website that you see on this screen, eligcert.ed.gov. And now let's go to the next slide where I can talk a little bit more about how that process works. Okay, so there are two pieces to the application process in terms of what documentation must be submitted. There's the financial aid administrator piece, who will complete the electronic application itself with input from the program representation. There are a number of sections on the EAP, but for a CTP program, we would expect sections A, E, and L to be completed. When completing the EAP, there's a section for zip code. This is these are codes that more or less track the subject matter of the program itself. And because these programs are generally of the type that don't have just one zip code that ties very nicely into the subject of the program, we have asked all CTP programs to input zip code 30.9999, which tracks to multidisciplinary/other. Now, the financial aid administrator will complete all of that information, and then generally it's incumbent upon the representation from the academic program to provide the rest of the documentation. Now, who ultimately submits it is completely up to you as the institution, but because the information in this piece is so much more about the nature of the program itself, it really should be completed by representatives of the academic program. And here we're talking about a narrative description, a detailed narrative description of how the CTP program meets all of the specific program eligibility requirements. We're also needing a copy of the satisfactory academic progress policy that applies to students in the CTP program, and we need a copy of the letter that was sent to the accrediting agency that informed that accrediting agency that a CTP program is being offered. I would like to stress again that this is not approval from the accrediting agency itself, just the letter that you sent to the accrediting agency informing them that you're offering this program. Now, the electronic application, the EAP itself, can be sent in through the website that was on one of the previous slides, but the narrative description is not submitted via that website. It's not something that you upload and submit. It's sent separately, via email. And in the electronic announcement that was linked to on a previous slide, all of the instructions regarding that email are in that electronic announcement, so please read it. Let's go to the next slide. Now, after you click Submit in the EAP, it's going to trigger a number of actions at Federal Student Aid where I work. We have an office, a program compliance office, that will receive the application and perform a review of the application. The internal review by Federal Student Aid will go over the core financial aid requirements, the general program eligibility requirements. For example, there's a requirement that all programs that would like to offer Pell Grants must include at least 15 weeks of instructional time. This is a question on the EAP itself, and internal Federal Student Aid staff will review your application to determine whether that requirement has been met. And we'll also be looking at things like the satisfactory academic progress policy. The narrative description itself will be sent to a panel of external reviewers. These are reviewers that we have selected and are experts in disability or students with disabilities. They are going to be reviewing the programs to determine whether they meet the definition of a CTP program. And so, if for whatever reason we are having difficulty understanding what you are saying in that narrative description, our program reviewers will ultimately get back to you and ask you for more information or for clarification regarding your narrative description. Now, something to understand about how these reviews are conducted is that the applications are initially sent to 2 external reviewers, and if both of them agree that your program meets the definition of the CTP program, then that's it. Their recommendation is sent to us, and we act on their recommendation and approve the program. If there's disagreement between the 2 reviewers, then ultimately the application will be sent to a 3rd reviewer who will render its decision. We're looking for a tiebreaker, for lack of a better term. And thereafter, if the 3rd individual says that, yes, this program is an approved or meets the definition of a CTP program, that recommendation is sent to us, and we act on that recommendation. Now, if for whatever reason we can't get to a place where enough of the reviewers agree that the program meets the definition of a CTP program, then we will get back to you and tell you that you're not approved. Now, just because you've not been approved the first time doesn't mean that you can't come back and address the concerns expressed by the program reviewers and submit another application. Obviously, that would take more time on the part of the institution, but just because approval is not initially granted doesn't mean that you can never become an approved CTP program. As far as timing goes, on average, it takes about 6 months from the time that the information is sent in to when the application is approved. But to the extent that we require more information from you, then that will necessarily prolong the application process. Let's go to the next slide. Some helpful hints about the application process itself. If you take no other suggestion from these lists of helpful hints, take the hint that our regulations have a list of criteria that must be met. And really all our program reviewers are trying to do is say with confidence that every single criteria of a CTP program is being met. So for example, Jessica talked about a requirement that the CTP program lead to a degree or certificate or identified outcomes established by you for all students in the program. So in your application, if you had that criteria listed and then explained how that criteria is met by your program, that makes it that much easier for the program reviewers to determine that you meet the criteria and that your program ultimately qualifies. Now, there are some obvious things like using page numbers and putting the name of your school in the header of the document, and providing supporting materials as necessary to provide examples of how you meet the requirements. But if you structure your narrative description in such a way where you identify the criteria that you're trying to meet and how your program meets that criteria, it really makes things a lot simpler for the reviewers. So in other words, don't just send in information that you've prepared for another audience, for another purpose. If you take the time up front to tailor your narrative description to our requirements, it's a lot easier for us and ultimately for you. Now, it's absolutely a quality over quantity sort of analysis, so we do have a limitation of 30 pages attached to their narrative descriptions. So again, this isn't sort of a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks sort of application process. So really, we give you ample opportunity to demonstrate how your program meets the eligibility requirements, but please don't send us your entire course catalog. Let's go to the next slide. We've had a lot of problems with CTP programs not accurately identifying the length of their programs. So double and triple check that the length that's identified in the e-app itself is correct. By way of follow-up, you can include non-credit courses or internship or work-based training in the length of the program for CTP programs. And in addition to that, CTP programs, by and large, have to undergo what's called clock to credit hour conversion. Now, I'll explain at a very high level what this is, but ultimately what this means is that you need to work with your financial aid administrator. I really can't stress that enough. Clock to credit hour conversion is required for programs that are not at least 2 years in length and that do not lead to a degree. So for most of you, that's a CTP program. Most of them don't lead to degrees, and most of them aren't at least 2 years in length. So if you don't offer a degree, you have to do this. If you want to use credit hours to document the length of your program and to determine how much aid students can receive. And really what this means is ultimately you will report credit hours to us, and that will be what you use to determine how much aid a student can receive, and really anything related to Title IV, these credit hours will be used. But the credit hours that you report to us and that are the basis of all of these determinations have to be determined pursuant to this formula, the clock to credit hour formula. And ultimately what it says is that any credit hour that you report to us as being part of this program has to map back to a certain number of clock hours, for example, 37.5 or 30. Again, we could do an entire webinar just on this issue alone, so I'm not going to get into any more detail about it, but please talk to your financial aid administrators about it. Let's go to the next slide. After your application has been submitted, we have the School Participation Division, which is an arm of our Program Compliance Office. They are all over the country, and every state has a specific regional office that they should contact with questions. And after your application is submitted, or really before your application is submitted and you have questions about the process, this is who you call. So for example, all of you in California should call our San Francisco office, and the phone number provided for the San Francisco office is on this slide. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, there are a few related issues that we should talk about before we deal with any questions. Jessica already mentioned that student eligibility starts in the academic term when approval is received. So if you apply right now in the spring of 2014 semester, but we don't give approval till fall, students become eligible back to their coursework that started in the fall term, even if the term has already started. The other thing to note about submitting an application for a CTP program, schools are free to continue awarding aid to students who are enrolled in any other eligible program at that institution. In other words, just because you apply to become an approved CTP program doesn't mean that you need to stop awarding Title IV aid to all of your other students. Let's go to the next slide. Also, the federal Pell Grant program is an entitlement program. This means that just because you have a larger number of students receiving Pell Grants at your school, it does not mean that other students will receive less aid as a result. It's not like there's one chunk of money that is given to each school and all students receiving money at the school have to draw from that one pot of money. It's an entitlement program, and so whatever the student is eligible to receive based on the formula that's used to determine eligibility is what they'll receive. In other words, students with intellectual disabilities will not lead to students without intellectual disabilities receiving less in federal Pell Grants. Now, the same cannot be said of the other two programs that students with intellectual disabilities could receive aid under, the FSCOG or Federal Work-Study programs. Institutions get bulk allocations for each year for these programs. And so to the extent that you have now a larger population of students who are eligible for aid in those two programs, it could ultimately mean that fewer students can actually receive aid under those programs. In short, there's one pool of money, and when that pool of money runs out, no more students can receive aid from those programs. Next slide, please. On our website, our studentaid.ed.gov website, we have a section of that site devoted to students with intellectual disabilities where we detail the basic student eligibility requirements that Jessica has outlined, and also provides information related to the definition of a CTP program, and also contains a list of currently approved CTP programs. And if we could breeze through the next two slides very quickly, you'll see that on those slides we have a list of every program that has been approved. And I'm now happy to say that we have so many programs that are approved, we can't fit them all on one slide. We had to go to 2 slides to list all of the programs. We're up to 30 of them now. So let's go now to slide 23. Or I'm sorry, slide 22. Thank you. The definition of a CTP program included this reference that the program leads to gainful employment. And so all of the gainful employment requirements that are currently in effect must be met by students or institutions that offer CTP programs, approved CTP programs. Currently, only the disclosure requirements associated with the gainful employment regulations are in effect. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, let's go back. I thought there was more. So, under the gainful employment regulations, there were a few pieces to them, but one of them included a series of formulas that said if an institution fails all of these formulas, then if the program fails all of these formulas, then the program could eventually lose eligibility to offer federal student aid to students enrolled in those programs. This was a program-by-program analysis, and so the first thing to note is that under this framework, just because one program could ultimately have lost eligibility under the gainful employment regulations, in no way jeopardize the ability of the rest of the institution to continue to offer federal student aid. The second thing to take away from this, and I'm not going to get into the formulas a lot themselves, but there were three, and because all three needed to be quote-unquote failed in order for an institution to run afoul of the gainful employment regulations, and one of them related to repayment of Title IV loans for which students in CTP programs aren't eligible, a CTP program under the gainful employment regulations could not have ultimately even lost eligibility to participate in the Title IV programs as a result of the gainful employment rules. Now, as I said, these formulas are not currently in effect. Only the disclosure requirements for the gainful employment initiative are in effect, and CTP programs are required to comply with those. We have a new set of gainful employment regulations that were published as proposed rules, and I encourage all of you to read those rules and to submit any comments that you have through our regulations.gov website, which is also where you could get a copy of the proposed rules. Next slide, please. We have an experimental sites initiative that is offered every so often, and back in 2011 we started a new round of experiments with the Title IV programs. There's one experiment currently running that would be of interest to CTP programs, and it essentially would provide for the ability of the parent of a dependent student to borrow a federal student loan to defray the cost of the CTP program for the student with an intellectual disability. This program is currently ongoing, and there are a few institutions with CTP programs participating. If and when you become approved, you as well would be free to participate in this program, in this initiative. There are a series of steps that would need to occur, starting first and foremost with an expression of interest and an amendment to the agreement that you've executed with us to allow you to make loans to students in these programs. There's a link on this slide with more information, including some instructions on how to move forward if any institution that ultimately is approved as a CTP with a CTP program could participate in the experiment. But I wanted to bring it up for anyone who's interested in applying to become a CTP program. Know that these are the types of things that you are potentially able to do if you get approval. Next slide. That's it. We're now ready, I think, to open it up to some questions, and Will, I'll leave it to you to remind people how we want to go about the question and answer session.
Thank you, Ian. So if your phones are muted, we could facilitate questions in two ways. You could type your question into the chat box, or you could unmute your phone by hitting *7. So is there a question out there? I see someone typing. I think there's a question coming. Okay, maybe not. So Molly Boyle will have your presentation. Molly?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me, Will?
Yes, I can.
Great. Hi, this is Molly. I'm going to be mindful of people's time, and I want to make sure you get to hear from Eric and Jeff, who have actually been through the process of applying to be a CTP. So I'm going to truncate my presentation a little bit here. But I wanted to first, next slide, please, let you know a little bit about what Think College is. If you don't know who we are already, we are a national organization dedicated to developing, expanding, and improving research and practice in inclusive higher education for people with intellectual disability. And one of the hats I wear at Think College, among others, is to focus on understanding the comprehensive transition program and support people who are trying to apply to become comprehensive transition programs. We have a number of resources on our site. I encourage you to go there and poke around, including a searchable program directory, a resource library, research to practice briefs, newsletters, journal articles, topical information on important issues. And what I want to focus on a little bit today is our online learning modules that we have. Next slide, please. Oh, it looks a little bloated here. Apologize for that. This image is not the way it should look, but what we finally call it Think, College, Learn, and we have a number of modules to help support people who are either thinking about becoming a program for students with intellectual disabilities or already have a program and need to find other ways to support what they're doing, such as financial aid, coaching and mentoring, universal design, job development, and then another module for families. What's nice about these is that we've made them as multimedia as possible, and that means that we have examples, videos, templates, checklists, webinar archives, links to federal resources, a number of things like that that can be very useful, and you can access those at your own self-paced way. Next slide, please. So this is what, if you were to go into the module on comprehensive transition programs, which I will tell you, it is a completed module. Will be live next week. We used to have a module which is currently out called financial aid, and we decided after working with a number of institutions that we really needed to call this comprehensive transition programs because that's what people are interested in. And so we reorganized our module and added a number of new features. It'll be live next week, like I said, but this is, if you were to click into it, this is what it would look like. And I originally was going to go through each section of this, but again, in terms of time, you can do this on your own. You can look at each section. We have our first section is requirements of the comprehensive transition programs, and that echoes exactly what Ian and Jessica said. The second one is preparing to apply to become a CTP, and that talks a little bit about all the things you might want to do in advance. Before you get to do this, how do you start working with a financial aid office? What does that mean to work with that office? If you're a financial aid office, how do you work with these new programs? How does that conversation work, and what is everybody's role and responsibility within that? We have a template in that section. We've actually done exactly like Ian said and taken each of the regulations for the program expectations, written them down, and put a blank there. So one thing you might want to think about is how you take each one of those regulations and answer that question as completely, concisely, and with examples as possible. We have an interactive application checklist with tips and examples, and you can actually go through, does my application have this, yes or no, and then you can print out a sheet so you will know what you need to add to that application. We have a guideline, a kind of a little infographic that talks about the CTP application submission and review process. It's exactly like Jessica said. We kind of put it through, made it graphically laid out so you can kind of see what that means and work with your office's judge and who has which role in that process. Section 5 of this module has other components related to student financial aid eligibility, and that includes, in particular, some things, frequently asked questions from families, because and also some resources to work with families to help to support them who may or may not be applying for financial aid for the first time. In the end, we ask you to provide some feedback on the module. So in order to understand what we're doing at Think College, I thought I would, give you a couple of screenshots of this. If whoever's in charge of the slides can fast forward through these all the way to my slide. You'll just see this kind of takes you through each section here, all the way to the question slide that we have for me. Slide 11, actually. And like I said earlier, really and truly, the modules are meant to be as interactive as possible. We'll include webinar archives, maybe even archives from this webinar. Anything up to date we can put on there, we put on there, and I'll make sure everybody has all the resources that they need at their fingertips on this particular issue. So one of the questions we get at Think College is, what are the pros and cons of completing an application and making federal financial aid available to students with ID? And I'd like to just say there's really no cons, and that's definitely coming from a particular standpoint, but we've never really seen anybody saying, wow, this is a terrible thing, I don't know why we did it. It's the real opportunity that this provides is very powerful. It gives aid to students and families, bottom line. Students get aid and they can have more access to college. Some programs are more expensive than others, and this can also provide a way for institutions to figure out one more way to blend and braid how they fund their streams of funding for students. One of the other interesting outcomes, and I think it's a real pro of this, is when programs are writing out their applications, they start to align themselves more with the college if they weren't aligned already. They're aligned, for example, coming up with a satisfactory academic progress. What does that look like? Is it different? Is it the same? How is it the same? Articulating those outcomes and goals has been a real pro for a lot of programs. And, finally, I guess it kind of goes without saying, but like Ian said earlier, this is creating equal opportunities for students to achieve college goals. And I bring up Ian because he mentions the Pell Grant and the question of, is this fair? Well, no, it really is fair. It's for everybody to be able to go to college and get access to federal financial aid to be able to succeed just like anybody else. Next question, please. I think I've kind of answered this question in my previous answer, but I'll say it again, is what is the significance of students with ID having access to federal financial aid and fully participating in higher education? Maybe I didn't say this earlier, but the pathways to employment. Going to college is a step along the way to getting a job and being gainfully employed. It also, we see the incredible diversity that these programs can provide to a college campus and the amazing maturation of students when they're able to attend college with their peers and a inclusive educational experience. Next slide, please. Okay, so I did give my quick and dirty version of this information we have at Think College. This is a snapshot of our website. I encourage you to look there because there's a number of resources. If you're looking for the Think College Learn modules, they're up under the training on there. We have a number of people who are willing and happy to help you. If you ever want to contact us, find us on Facebook, find us on Twitter. And I will, at the very last slide, if you don't mind fast forwarding, give you my personal contact information. Even though I work for UMass Boston and I am a Massachusetts employee, I actually live in Santa Monica, California. So please feel free to use me as a resource. I am local, and I'm very, very happy to help anybody who has any questions about their process of applying to become a CTP. I'll turn it over to you, Will, for some questions.
Are there any questions from the field, from the participants on the call? Any questions? I see someone typing.
I see that too, Will. And while the person's typing, I just want to emphasize we do have examples of completed comprehensive transition program applications in our resource database and on that module I was telling you about. So one of the most common questions we get is, what does this look like when it's done? What does the actual thing look like? So please know that there are examples up there that we've been given permission by the Institute of Higher Education to share with people.
So we'll wait just a couple of seconds here. I see someone typing still. Do you have a question, the person that I'm hearing? Okay, so there's a comment in the chat box. For financial aid directors, a CTP program is very different than any other type of program, degree, or certificate that we work with. Okay. Well, we'll let the individuals who actually have a CTP program respond to this. Molly, do you wanna address this concern? Chris, if you'd like, you could hit *7 to unmute your line.
I think it's great that Chris is encouraging people, Will. I do think it is different, but it is doable once you just sit down and do the task. We do talk to a lot of financial aid folks, and it's new, so it's different. But if you're willing to commit to doing the work, I think it's a very positive experience.
So, Chris, is there anything else you'd like to add? Chris is saying that they have a program at their college, a CTP program, and that's why she's encouraging folks to complete the application and become a CTP. Okay. Eric Latham and Jeff Ross.
This is Eric. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, very good. Well, I think Jeff and I agreed that I would go first, and I will be brief because I only have one slide, so there will be no forwarding for this. Basically, what Jessica, Ian, and Molly have all said is incredibly important, and those are the reason I put those two points on my slide. And first of all, and I'll address the second one first, the folks at the Department of Education were incredibly helpful when we were trying to figure out how to get through this process. I called Ian a number of times, and he answered his phone personally, and he answered all my questions. He was willing to actually also schedule a conference call with our financial aid folks here at UCLA to kind of walk them through the process and kind of alleviate many of their fears. I'm not sure he's going to do that for everybody, but at the time we did it, he was extremely helpful. And when our application had been forwarded to the Department of Education, Molly was also very helpful in helping me get some feedback and things like that. So use these folks. They are everybody wants to kind of make it work for you, and they are a wealth of information. And a lot of this stuff is very complicated. And as Chris was pointing out in the chat box, it is a very different animal for the financial aid folks, and that is why I put the first point on there. You have to get to know them. You have to have a relationship, and if you're building a relationship at the point you're applying for CTP, that might be just a little bit too late. But so if you don't have a relationship, get to know them. In our case here at UCLA, I work for Extension, which is the continuing education part of the university. We have our own financial aid office in addition to the UCLA office, and we have more students, more enrollments than UCLA does. So we have our own transcript system, and we have a whole bunch of parallel systems, but everything we do has to flow through the university. So I had to go through two different levels in order to get things processed. And there were a lot of fears for folks. When we were applying, the whole gainful employment issue was a big thing. Those regulations had come out, and that was causing a real headache. But believe it or not, the most challenging thing for the institution was that our program has non-credit courses. Those show up on transcripts, but they don't carry units with them. And the systems that communicate between Extension and the university only understand units. And so there was a lot of concern about putting these unit equivalents because we had to assign some kind of units based on the clock hours to meet the requirements. And they were very concerned about sending over to the university these unit equivalents. And so that was oddly the biggest hang-up. And it took 18 months for the application that I originally wrote to get through the bureaucratic mechanisms here at the university before it even got sent to the Department of Education. So you really do have to get to know your financial aid folks. Make sure they're clear about what your program is about and what you're doing. I had to get myself very familiar with the regulations for the CTP because I had to explain many of those things to our deans and also to the financial aid folks. My third point there about being consistent, for us, we have dozens and dozens of programs that receive financial aid. At Extension, we only do certificate-based programs, so everything we've done, we created it just like any other program. We set it up. I used the same format, which flowed directly into the CTP application, and I just did it from the beginning. So looking at what other people were doing within the institution was incredibly helpful for us. Being clear and easy to track, we made a decision early on because the law does allow you to track other things, participation hours and things like that, but we made a very clear decision that we were only going to track things through the transcript system, and then we have a parallel system that we use here that tracks progress towards a certificate, and those two systems are linked. So as grades are achieved in classes, those get recorded in the transcript system and get transferred to the certificate tracking system. So we can at any time look up an individual student and find out where they stand in the process. But we decided that we are only going to track those things that could be put into the transcript system. So all the classes, even the non-credit classes, we just assigned unit equivalents to those. But one of the hidden gems that we found that allowed us to be flexible, because we have a group of required classes and we also have a group of classes that students get to choose, we use extensively independent studies. Because we had a mechanism to do that within the institution, because that's a very common thing. There's a whole process. You have to write it out, and you have to spell out how students meet those requirements. And so all of the inclusive portions of our program are independent study. And then as we register students, we put in the exact title and the exact number of units. And so that worked very well for us. My last point, and then I'll turn it over to Jeff, is planning ahead for changes. And this is actually the one con that I have found with this whole thing, is it took us a long time to get the approval, not because of the Department of Education, but the people on our side. And we need to make a significant change in the program. So we're going to change the curriculum. So we're going to have to go through this process again. So just be aware of, so what you're putting in, it gives you legitimacy, gives people access to financial aid, but it does add a bureaucratic step to making changes to the program. So you have to be as flexible as possible, but also plan ahead for time if you do have to make changes. And the very last thing I would say is that in terms of helping people with the financial aid, students and their families, we created a separate flyer that has all the information. I got some great stuff off the Think College website. They have a whole FAQ about filling out the FAFSA that goes through the specific questions that Claudia and Ian were talking about. And I put it all into a thing. I included the definition of intellectual disability, and so it's all spelled out for people, and that is kind of the mechanism that we use for assisting people to make the initial application through the FAFSA. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
While Jeff is getting ready, I just want to read one of the comments that was placed in the chat box. Chris Scher is with the Santa Rosa Junior College. She's with financial aid, and one of the things she indicated is that your credit units or your units and clock hours will seem small, but not to worry about that. Although listed on the program participation agreement as a vocational program, the satisfactory academic progress is different and the program gets qualified. The square peg is fitting into the round hole of the program participation agreement. It takes a while, but don't give up. Thank you, Chris, for your comment.
Okay, and this is Jeff. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Hey, a couple of things that I would like to just reiterate, and that is just having that working relationship with your financial aid folks. We were one of the initial colleges to go through the application process, and everybody was in financial aid where we'd never heard of this. What are you talking about? So it took a lot of collaboration, and I was very, very happy to see Ian put up that slide that had all of the colleges now that are actually are now CTP programs and are now experts. So that I'm sure we can refer our financial aid folks to some of these people who've gone through the same process. Once we got the approval, what we've done is we're a small college, and what we've done is that we've worked with our financial aid department to actually to do orientations with us, to do orientations with parents, and they're very willing to do that. And so, like last week, we had our new incoming group of students that are going to join the TIL program next year. Our parents were here. Financial aid, they spent about 45 minutes with the parents going over all of the process. Then when our students get here in August, financial aid will come down. They will assist us in filling out FAFSAs with all of our students, and they've just become a very, very integral part in the implementation of the whole program. Now, once we, I think one of the questions that's out there is, how many students qualify and are students using, the grants? And so what we found, and I think it's going to be pretty consistent, is that individuals that go away to college usually have some financial backing, and so not all of our students actually qualify financially for Pell. Only about 1/3 of our students actually do that, until they turn to age 24. And most of our students enter my program when they're age 22, 23. So we follow up on our students when they're age 24 to actually to do the FAFSA to make sure that they're eligible, because they are eligible at that point based on their own income, not the income of their parents. So, but the actual implementation of the Pell Grant has been very significant in meeting those needs for our students. We're a residential program, so the money that that our students get from Pell goes towards room and board and that sort of thing, and the expenses of living on campus. So it's been very, very good. As Ian pointed out, it's an entitlement program, and so you're not competing with the rest of the institution. However, there is that other aspect of college work study, which has been an institutional grant, and so that's been more difficult to get some of our students to be able to access that institutional work study money. We're still working with our financial aid office to include us in that, and I think we're going to make some pretty good strides this next year. So all in all, I think that I'm really, really happy that we went through the process. It has benefited our students immensely, and I think one of the other aspects, too, is that it really does integrate this program into the mainstream of all aspects of financial aid and the rest of the campus, too.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Sure.
While I'm waiting for questions from the field, I have already received one, and it's a question for Jessica and Ian. What are some of the most frequently found challenges that have been present in applications that you've seen, reviewed, or that your team has reviewed?
Sorry,
Again, the question.
it took me a second to get unmuted here.
Sure.
I think that really one of the biggest problems, as Ian was saying, is that schools haven't very clearly indicated how their program meets each regulatory requirement. And so we would really stress that schools, when they're developing their applications, that they be very, very clear about which requirement they're trying to address. And, again, they're outlined in the regulations. They're outlined also in our electronic announcement. And then also very clearly say how their program meets that requirement. That's probably the biggest stumbling block. Some schools have had some trouble with their STAT policies. Some schools, like Jeff said, have had some trouble with their credit clock hour conversions and working with their financial aid office to get to that point. But for the most part, if they're outlining things clearly, if they're working with their financial aid offices, they seem to be getting through the process pretty well, I would say. Ian, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
I think I've seen a lot of people from the program side of the house, again, for lack of a better term, really trying to take it upon themselves to try and learn the e-app and what's in it and how they complete it. And some people have gone so far as to seem like they themselves are going to take it upon themselves to submit their financial aid application. And I'm not saying that that's wrong necessarily, but I feel like that would be unduly frustrating for a lot of schools. And ultimately, you would be better served by, sitting down with the financial aid office and really impressing upon them what this is, how it works, why it's good, and getting them to help you, and not trying to, frankly, learn another language, because financial aid, it's complicated, and we have entire offices at institutions that are devoted to it for a reason. So I've said it once, I've said it twice, I think I've now said it a third time, but really, really work with your financial aid administrator.
Thank you, Ian. Another question, you probably have said this in some ways, but is there a surefire way of getting the CTP application approved?
No, I mean, it's a similar type of answer. Identify each regulatory requirement, write a narrative description about how you meet that requirement. Be specific. One thing that we've seen as a holdup is that sometimes people are submitting documents to us that have been prepared for other people. So, for example, some schools, you have to get approval from your state in some cases, and they're writing their application to us using the same materials that they did for their state. And a lot of the information is going to be the same, but it might not need to be framed exactly the same way. You don't want to just wholesale give us something that you've used for another purpose or for your TIPSID grant application or something like that. So make sure that you're preparing it for the CTP application so that you have the correct audience and that you're framing it in a way that matches the regulations. And then also if you're using other documents, like if you're referencing your school catalog or something, make sure you're clearly marking the reference and explain again how it demonstrates that a requirement is met. So it's not like there's a magic bullet, but it's just about being very clear, writing for the right audience, and just really very explicitly linking your program to the CTP program eligibility requirements in Part O.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So for the last few minutes that we have on the call, the lines are unmuted so that anyone that has a question may ask the question now. Do we have any questions from the field, the participants on the call? Susie, if you have a question, I believe you can speak directly on the call. Eric Latham has provided his email address for those of you that in completing your application you may want to collaborate or consult with Eric. You may do that. Questions from others or comments? Another comment from Chris Scheer, again, Santa Rosa Junior College, is that when the financial aid director has a question or is confused by something in the application, it might be a good idea to refer that financial aid director to one of the or several of the 30 schools that already have been approved as CTPs. They may do well by consulting with their financial aid colleagues at those programs that are already CTPs. So I'll give this last 30 seconds to anyone out there that has an additional question or comment or concern. Okay, thank you very much. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties on the front end of the webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jessica, Ian, Molly, Eric, and Jeff for their participation and wealth of knowledge that they've shared with the programs. Again, you will receive the link to this webinar after the webinar, as well as an evaluation so that you could provide some feedback on the information you received. Thank you very much to all.